Welcome back to Manpractice. I'm your host, Aaron Bensick, and thank you for joining me for today's practice. We'll jump right into the topic today. It's going to coincide with a video on processing anger, and this is going to be the second part to it, and this is going to be declaring conflict. I don't want to say oftentimes, but there will be times after you've felt angry, needed to process that, and you realize, say, a boundary has been crossed and needs to be reestablished, or you consented to something that you really had no business consenting to, or just the situation's completely out of alignment with who you are and how you hold your space, and some sort of conflict, some sort of confrontation needs to be engaged with. And so what I found most useful for me is I have a formal protocol for this on how I conduct my life and how I hold my space, and this is just a protocol that's part of that. And for years I didn't have this, and a big part of that is for years I didn't think that what I wanted in life mattered. I had such a low opinion of myself. The self-worth was so low that the things that mattered to me I didn't think were important enough to address. And so a lot of these items for years would go unaddressed, and I just would never talk to anyone about anything. I wouldn't express the impact of certain situations on me, and I took this very passive approach. And even once I got to a point where the self-worth and the perception of myself had shifted, there was this next part of me that I had to address, and that was in basically giving a fuck what people thought about me, because there was a lot of fear early on about, am I going to be perceived as that guy that's rocking the boat, or should I just go along to get along? Or there's that old adage of, would you rather be happy or would you rather be right? And I felt like I was almost abusing all of those so that I didn't actually have to deal with things in my life, so that I didn't have to face things head on. And the reality is in facing things, in confronting the things that need to be confronted that are out of alignment with who I am, I find I'm actually a lot happier. And all in all, I find that there's a lot fewer situations where I actually do have to impose the protocol that I'm going to discuss with you today. Because the reality of it is when I've got my life structured the way that I do, with the self-worth, with the perception of myself, with the boundaries, with the things I consent to and that I don't, there's fewer opportunities to even need to engage in conflict. So even when they do come up, they feel very different than what they used to. They don't feel like this big, over-the-top, overwhelming, potentially dramatic scenario that they used to be. Because when I wouldn't address these things, they would just sit and fester, and I would try and pretend like nothing was bothering me, but on a subconscious level, all that stuff would still sit inside of me. And sometimes it would come out sideways as like these passive aggressive digs towards people, or I'd just kind of be nitpicking at someone, not fully expressing what actually needed to be said or what I wanted to say. At the very worst, when it would all come to a head, then sometimes it would even result in just direct attacks on people. And both of those outcomes resulted in more conflict. And so that's where I realized I needed to have a formal protocol in my life for how I'm going to do this. And it's actually really, really simple. And I find most things that work consistently are that simple. I just needed to get clear on me and who I was and what was in alignment with me first. And step one for me in this is just a formal declaration of conflict. I mentally make a declaration of conflict when I know there's something that needs to be addressed, or when I need to engage with another human in a potentially confronting situation. And I know this sounds over the top or dramatic or extreme, and sometimes I'll even give myself visions of like storming the fucking beaches of Normandy, or the Viking who's putting on his warlord paint and sharpening his axe and getting some heads ready to roll. And in doing that, because it's like so ridiculous and over the top, it actually takes a lot of the emotion out of it for me. It takes a lot of the sting out of it for me. And what I'm actually just doing is invoking a policy that I live by in my life. And with all of that emotion, all of that removed, it starts to feel like a fun game of just getting to address this thing now. It's just a business transaction at this point. I'm going to go through this process now. I'm going to engage with this other human, and we'll get this addressed, and we'll go back to life. And it takes a lot of the guesswork and a lot of the emotion and potential opportunity for fallout out of the way. And once I've formally made that declaration of conflict and potentially what boundary needs to be reestablished, essentially I have to get clear with me on what I consent to, what I don't, what my boundaries are, what they're not, and what boundaries actually got crossed and how I want to reestablish them. And so it's very important that I get clear on all of that before I engage. And so that's the second part. And then the third part is just the formality of walking through the conversation with whoever the other party would be. It's really not that complicated. Now, I typically don't like to... I've seen a lot of scenarios where it almost feels like a hijacking or like a dive bombing. And I've been guilty of this in the past too, where I would almost like swoop in unannounced or unexpected or catch them off guard. And even that had to cease for this to be as effective as it can be. And realistically, the way I operate on this now is if it can be done in the moment, then I will. But most of the time, what I end up doing is reaching out to whoever the conversation needs to be had with and just asking for a few minutes of their time at some point. Depending on the severity of the item, I'll ask if it can be the next day or just in the next week. Can we have a conversation about X, Y, and Z? And then once we engage in the conversation at the scheduled time, now at that point there's a safe, constructive space that's created for it. Both people are then typically showing up more resourced and more focused. One person's not caught off guard and feeling kind of hijacked or blindsided by anything. And so you're already meeting on equal terms at that point. And that's where a lot of the power in this comes from, is keeping the playing field even. And so when you start out on even terms, both people are agreeing to this conversation, both people are consenting to it, and then I just open the conversation with something very, very simple, like, when you said X, Y, and Z, I'm curious what your intentions were, or I'm curious what your positive intentions were. And those are one of the two things that I will lead with. And then I'll follow it with because I felt, and then I'll express how I felt when X, Y, and Z was said, or when X, Y, and Z was done. And then here's the really important part. I have a feeling this was not your intention, is what I will say next. I have a feeling this was not your intention. I know you, but I don't understand what was actually happening here, and I feel confused about it and a little frustrated. So would you be able to help me clear this up, or is there a different way you can say this, or is there a conversation we can have about this to unpack this a little further, because I really do want to understand this relationship with you is important, and I don't like whatever this feeling is that's between us right now. And then at that point, it's very simple. You just shut the fuck up and give them the opportunity to meet you in that. And because you've asked them to express where they're at, and you've expressed vulnerably where you're at, and you're in a constructive space designed just for this conversation, the likelihood of them meeting you in that is going to be far greater than any of the other approaches that I expressed at the beginning of this, that I caused a lot of suffering and pain in my life. And at that point, then a dialogue can naturally unfold. And there's a lot less propensity for either person to get defensive in this, but even if there is, because so much empathy has already been shown, it's easier to kind of rein it back in and focus on what the topic at hand is and to continue to meet each other in it. Now, I'm not saying you won't experience some defensiveness. I'm not saying you still may not feel attacked. Stuff like that is going to come up. People are fucking human. I'm fucking human. And the reality is sometimes when you're engaging in conflict, you're going to feel more energy than you maybe normally would, or that you would desire to. Because I know when I first started engaging in these, I didn't like necessarily feeling that charge inside of me, or feeling like there was more going on inside of me than just a calm state. But these are potentially serious topics that do need to be addressed. So it's not going to be uncommon to feel a full range of emotions, your full range of the human experience. And that's okay. And I just had to normalize that and accept that and play around with the fact that that is okay for me to feel all these things. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with me for feeling these things. There's something out of alignment in my space. It's being addressed right now. Of course, I'm going to feel various things other than just calmness or just happiness. And so my suggestion is to continue to play around with those feelings and normalize them and accept that they're just a part of you. And the more that I accepted that they were just a part of me, the easier this process got. And even the conversations that would be considered a little more stickier in the past, they're still exponentially cleaner and able to move through them regardless of what the topic is than some of those methods that I expressed at the beginning of this. So, declaring conflict. That's today's practice. So, when's the last time you've practiced formally declaring conflict, or formally even having a policy on how you're going to declare conflict in a healthy way with the other people in your life? Because it is going to come up. It's not something that can be avoided, at least not for any long period of time, and have a happy, sustainable life or relationships with other humans. So thank you for joining me for today's practice. If you've gotten value out of this, or you know someone that might get some value out of this, like, subscribe, share it, leave us a comment, and we'll see you next time. Love you guys.